Hi everyone, welcome to part one of the critical period to federalism. Looking at our questions to think about here, what were the deficiencies of the Articles of Confederation and what convinced people that a new form of government was necessary? Because of the fear of a strong central government, the states had organized into a loose confederation, but the results left the national government unable to conduct the necessary business of the new nation. The Articles of Confederation had formed, quote, a firm league of friendship, end quote. And it might be worthwhile to think about this as more of a political alliance rather than a national government, relatively speaking, because it was necessary for the colonies/states to come together to win their independence from Britain, but they really didn't have much practice working together, at least not until protest turned to revolution. The states had all created independent constitutions after the Declaration of Independence, but the states came together ostensibly as one nation with the Articles of Confederation, and power was still definitely in the hands of the state legislatures, given all of the things that the national government could not do. But this system made sense to them. They were used to running their own affairs, and the national government's only purpose was to coordinate the things they needed to cooperate on, like defeating the British or dealing with Native Americans or the Spanish in the aftermath of the Revolution. It's important to understand that the Confederation government had very little authority over the individual states. In fact, one could argue that the states were not truly bound to remain in the Union, even though the preamble of the Articles of Confederation stated that the Union was perpetual. Taking a look at the deficiencies of the Confederation government, first and foremost, Congress could not regulate interstate trade. And this is a little bit bizarre because it means that potentially one state could implement a tax or a tariff or an import duty on goods coming in from another state. Also, Congress could not set tariffs for goods coming in from foreign nations. So not surprisingly, we often saw foreign ships sort of shop around for which state had the best import duties. And so they went to those port cities rather than some of the others. Third, Congress could not tax the American people directly. If we think about the whole rallying cry of the American Revolution as no taxation without representation, it makes sense that these people didn't want to see a powerful national government impose taxes on them. That sounded way too much like living under the British Empire. And then finally, any changes to the Articles of Confederation required a unanimous vote. And this is the reason why there were no amendments to the Articles of Confederation, because 13 people can't decide on what kind of pizza they're going to have for lunch. They're certainly not going to agree on any particular change to their structure of government. By the time we get to 1786, it had become painfully obvious to many people that the Articles of Confederation needed to be revised if the nation was to survive. So in September of 1786, delegates from 5 states met in Annapolis, Maryland, to discuss the issue and to advise Congress on potential changes. But the problem was only 5 states sent delegates. This is not a quorum. So really, the only thing the Annapolis Convention could do would be to advise Congress to hold a second meeting in the spring in Philadelphia to address the issues in the articles. But honestly, there was nothing to suggest that a future meeting would be any better attended than the Annapolis Convention was. But something happens to change people's minds. Several thousand impoverished farmers in western Massachusetts were complaining of high taxes, the high interest rates on their mortgages and other loans, and the insensitivity of the state government to their problems. They argued that they worked hard, but they always found themselves in debt to Eastern creditors. So we have a sense of a rural versus urban divide here. So in the fall of 1786, Daniel Shays, who was a veteran of the Battle of Bunker Hill, and his armed neighbors closed down a county courthouse where creditors were suing to foreclose farm mortgages. At one point, the rural insurgents threatened to seize the arsenal located at Springfield, Massachusetts. So this situation is interesting because what is happening, these men are occupying the county courthouse to prevent foreclosure hearings from taking place. So nobody loses their farm if there's not a hearing. But this is a threat not only to the authority of the state of Massachusetts, but it's also a threat to the United States government. And the problem was that Congress didn't have sufficient funds to support an army to put down the uprising. The way this is solved is a wealthy group of Bostonians raise money for an army of 4,000 troops to put down the insurrection. SHAYS'S rebellion symbolized the breakdown of law and order that some had long predicted, and it gave weight to the argument that the Articles of Confederation needed to be revised. One person, however, was unconcerned about SHAYS'S rebellion. Thomas Jefferson had a particular perspective when it came to what took place and why it mattered. So Thomas Jefferson was serving as the American ambassador to France and at the time that SHAYS'S rebellion happened, and he was writing a letter back about a situation where the British press had been inflaming these ideas that the United States was essentially in anarchy and that the country was going to fall apart pretty soon. Jefferson has a really interesting take on what's happening here. So from the letter, he says, the British ministry have so long hired their gazetteers, their newspapermen, to repeat and model into every form lies about our being in anarchy, that the world has at length believed them. The English nation has believed them. The ministers themselves have come to believe them. And what is more wonderful, we have believed them ourselves. Yet where does this anarchy exist? Where did it ever exist except in the single instance of Massachusetts? And can history produce an instance of a rebellion so honorably conducted? I say nothing of its motives. They were founded in ignorance, not wickedness. God forbid we should ever be 20 years without such a rebellion. The people cannot be all and always well informed. The part which is wrong will be discontented in proportion to the importance of the facts they misconceive. If they remain quiet, so in other words, if the people remain quiet under misconceptions, it is lethargy, the forerunner of death to the public liberty. We have had 13 states independent 11 years. There has been one rebellion. That comes to one rebellion in a century and a half for each state. What country before ever existed a century and a half without a rebellion? And what country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? This is the most powerful line in this letter. So again, what country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? The power of the government comes from the people, and Jefferson is emphasizing this fact. He says, let them take arms. The remedy is to set them right as to facts, pardon, and pacify them. What signify a few lives lost in a century or two? The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Not everyone was as sort of optimistic as Thomas Jefferson when it came to the significance of SHAYS'S rebellion. But the important thing is that SHAYS'S rebellion inspires people to seriously reconsider the Articles of Confederation. So in the spring of 1787 in Philadelphia, 55 men representing 12 states met to discuss the matter. Initially, Rhode Island refuses to participate, although that will change later on. One thing that's interesting when we consider the Constitutional Convention, because this is the meeting that would produce the Constitution that we live under today, is that James Madison of Virginia comes prepared not to revise the Articles of Confederation, but to toss them out and to start over from scratch. And so he presents this lengthy structure for a new government. We call this the Virginia Plan because James Madison is from Virginia. Much of what James Madison proposes would eventually become part of the Constitution, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about what the Virginia Plan looked like. But the important thing to consider is James Madison essentially drops this bomb on the other delegates. And so in response, delegates from New Jersey propose a system of revising the Articles of Confederation. But when the delegates voted on the New Jersey plan, they voted against it. But they weren't necessarily ready to accept the Virginia plan wholeheartedly. And so the debate begins of what a new national government should look like. It brings up a big question for the whole structure of the United States government. For whom are we forming a government? When we consider the Articles of Confederation, this is truly a government where the states are represented. A good way to think about the Articles of Confederation government is like the United Nations, that Virginia is represented in the Confederation government, that Maryland, that Massachusetts, that Georgia are represented in the Confederation Congress. But what James Madison argues is that if we are going to be a republic, then the people of the United States should be represented. And in the Confederation government, each state has one vote. And Madison's argument is that there are 747,000 people living in Virginia. They get one vote. There are only 68,000 people living in Rhode Island, and yet they have one vote. So how is this a republic? How is this the people being represented in the government? So this becomes a big issue because some people like the idea of the states being represented, especially those small states, because they felt like their voices were going to be drowned out by the states with a larger population. So coming back to our questions to think about, what were the deficiencies of the Articles of Confederation? There were many. Congress could not tax the American people directly. The Congress could not regulate interstate trade. The Congress could not set tariffs. We have a situation where in order to create an amendment, you had to have a unanimous vote, and that just never happened. And so what convinced people that a new form of government was necessary? SHAYS'S Rebellion. SHAYS'S Rebellion demonstrated that the Confederation government, under the Articles of Confederation, was too weak to even defend its own authority. So James Madison presents a proposal for a new national government, and we'll take a look at that in part 2.